In 2024, a single archaeological discovery shattered everything we thought we knew about Viking shipbuilding. A team of researchers scanning the depths with ground-penetrating radar uncovered something that shouldn't exist: ship construction techniques that predate the Viking Age by centuries, hidden beneath Norwegian soil for over a millennium. But here's what the textbooks won't tell you: this wasn't the first time evidence has emerged that contradicts the official narrative of how these legendary vessels came to be. In laboratories across Scandinavia, scientists are quietly discovering that the wood, the rivets, even the very design principles of Viking longships contain secrets that challenge our understanding of medieval maritime technology. Tonight we'll journey together through the shadowed archives of marine archaeology, where suppressed evidence and overlooked discoveries paint a very different picture of these mysterious vessels. What if the true origins of Viking longships have been deliberately obscured? What if there's more to their story than raids and exploration? Stay with us as we uncover the hidden mysteries that scholars have debated in closed circles for decades and discover why some of the most significant archaeological findings of our time have never made it into the history books you remember from school. Picture yourself standing on the windswept shores of Saaremaa, an Estonian island, where the Baltic Sea whispers ancient secrets to those who know how to listen. It was here in 2008 that archaeologists made a discovery so extraordinary that it would force them to rewrite the very timeline of Viking maritime supremacy. As workers prepared to lay water pipes through what seemed like ordinary farmland, their machinery struck something hard beneath the soil. What emerged from that Estonian earth wasn't just another archaeological find. It was evidence of a mystery that academic institutions had been quietly grappling with for over a decade. The Salme ship burials, as they came to be known, contained not one but two vessels filled with the remains of Scandinavian warriors. 33 men in total, their bodies carefully arranged in rows within ships that bore all the hallmarks of Viking craftsmanship. But there was one problem, a problem that would make certain scholars deeply uncomfortable. These ships dated to between 700 and 750 AD decades, before what historians call the official beginning of the Viking Age. The traditional narrative tells us that Viking raids began with the attack on Lindisfarne in 793 AD, marking the dawn of Scandinavian maritime dominance. Yet here, buried in Estonian soil, lay evidence that sophisticated Viking ship technology existed generations earlier. Imagine the quiet conversations that must have taken place in university corridors when these dates were confirmed. Picture the careful phrasing of academic papers, the strategic omissions from popular histories. For if the Salme ships represent the norm rather than the exception, then everything we've been taught about the emergence of Viking seafaring prowess begins to unravel. The warriors found in these ships weren't local defenders or raiders caught in some forgotten skirmish. Analysis of their remains, their weapons, and their grave goods revealed them to be Scandinavians, most likely from what we now call Sweden, some 150 miles across the Baltic Sea. They had travelled far from home, carrying with them not just their weapons and personal belongings, but the secrets of shipbuilding techniques that supposedly hadn't yet been invented. But perhaps most intriguingly, these weren't hastily buried casualties of war. The care with which these men were interred, the precious objects placed alongside them, the very fact that not one but two ships were used for their burial. All of this speaks to a level of organisation planning and cultural sophistication that challenges our assumptions about this supposedly primitive period. As you settle into your evening contemplation, consider this: if these Estonian graves represent just one example of pre-Viking Age maritime sophistication, how many other sites remain undiscovered? How many other inconvenient truths lie buried beneath the carefully maintained narrative of Viking origins? The Salme discovery wasn't an anomaly, it was a crack in the foundation of established historical chronology. And as we'll see, it was only the beginning of a pattern of evidence that certain institutions seem remarkably reluctant to fully acknowledge. There's something almost mystical about ancient wood, the way it holds memory in its grain, preserving secrets across centuries with silent fidelity. When archaeologists first began applying modern scientific techniques to Viking ship remains, they expected to confirm what they already knew. Instead, they uncovered mysteries that continue to whisper questions no one seems willing to answer publicly. The technique is called dendrochronology tree ring dating, and it should be straightforward. Count the rings, match the patterns to known climate data, determine when the tree was felled. Simple, reliable, scientific. But when researchers began examining the timber used in Viking longships, the results painted a picture far more complex than anyone had anticipated. Consider the Gokstad ship, that magnificent vessel discovered in 1880 and now residing in Oslo's Viking Ship Museum. When modern analysis finally revealed the age of its timber, something extraordinary emerged. The trees used in its construction had been felled across different time periods some decades apart, but not in the way you might expect from a ship built with whatever wood was available. The pattern was too deliberate, too sophisticated. Specific types of timber had been selected and seasoned for precise purposes: oak for the keel, aged to exactly the right flexibility; pine for the mast, chosen for its specific density characteristics. This wasn't random scavenging. This was evidence of a timber preparation process that required decades of planning and an understanding of wood science that historians insist didn't exist in medieval Scandinavia. But there's something even more puzzling hidden in the grain of this ancient wood. Isotope analysis, a technique that reveals the geographic origin of timber, has shown that some Viking ships were built with wood from regions hundreds of miles apart. The Skuldelev ships, for instance, contained timber from Norway, Denmark, and even Ireland, all carefully integrated into a single vessel's construction. This isn't simply evidence of trade networks, though. Those networks themselves challenge our understanding of medieval commerce. This is evidence of something far more sophisticated, a coordinated system of timber selection and distribution that required not just trade relationships, but standardized knowledge of wood properties across vast geographic distances. Imagine yourself as a medieval shipwright faced with the task of selecting timber for a vessel that must survive the brutal conditions of the North Atlantic. How would you know that oak from a specific region of Norway, seasoned for exactly 7 years, would provide the perfect flexibility for a ship's keel? How would you coordinate with suppliers across Scandinavia to ensure the right wood was available at the right time? The clinker construction technique itself, that characteristic overlapping plank method that defined Viking shipbuilding, presents its own mysteries. Modern naval architects have attempted to replicate these construction methods using period tools and techniques. The results have been humbling. Time and time again, contemporary craftsmen have found it virtually impossible to achieve the precision and durability of original Viking construction without modern tools. The planks in a Viking longship overlapped with tolerances measured in fractions of inches. The iron rivets that held them together were placed with mathematical precision, their spacing calculated to distribute stress across the hull in ways that modern computer modeling shows to be nearly optimal. Yet we're told this was accomplished by shipwrights working with hand tools and supposedly limited technical knowledge. Dr. Ole Crumlin Pedersen, one of the world's leading experts on Viking ships, once observed that the level of precision found in these vessels would challenge even modern boat builders. Yet rather than questioning how such precision was achieved, the academic establishment has largely chosen to marvel at Viking intuitive craftsmanship, while avoiding the deeper implications of what this precision actually represents. As you drift towards sleep tonight, let your mind wander through the forests of medieval Scandinavia. Picture the careful selection of trees, the patient seasoning of timber, the coordination of resources across vast distances. And ask yourself what kind of organized knowledge system could have made such precision possible in an age that historians describe as primitive and decentralized. The wood remembers. The question is whether we're willing to listen to what it's trying to tell us. Deep in the climate-controlled storage facilities of Scandinavia's greatest museums, beyond the public galleries and tourist displays, lie collections that most visitors will never see. It's here in these carefully maintained archives that some of the most intriguing evidence about Viking longships has been quietly gathering dust for decades. The restoration of the Oseberg ship, that magnificent vessel discovered in 1904, should have been a triumph of archaeological preservation. Instead, it became something far more complicated, a cautionary tale about how the eagerness to display history can sometimes obscure the truth that history is trying to reveal. When Norwegian and Danish craftsmen first attempted to reconstruct the Oseberg ship in 2004, using detailed photographic and laser scans of the original, they made a disturbing discovery. During the initial restoration process in the early 20th century, breaches had been made in some of the ship's beams alterations that had never been properly documented or acknowledged. The ship on display in Oslo's Viking Ship Museum wasn't quite the same vessel that had emerged from its burial mound. This revelation came to light almost by accident, discovered only when modern builders couldn't understand why their faithful replica kept failing where the original had succeeded. The earlier replica, known as the Dronningen, had actually sunk during testing, a failure that was quietly attributed to construction errors rather than problems with the historical model itself. But the Oseberg alterations represent just one example of a broader pattern that emerges when you know where to look. Museum storage facilities across Scandinavia contain artifacts from Viking ship excavations that have never been fully catalogued, analysed, or published. Ship components that don't fit established narratives tend to find their way into storage, where they await further study that somehow never quite materializes. Consider the collection of iron artifacts recovered from the Gokstad ship burial. While the ship itself and its major grave goods have been exhaustively documented, dozens of smaller iron pieces remain unexamined in museum storage. Some of these pieces appear to be ship fittings of unknown function, constructed with a level of sophistication that doesn't align with our understanding of 9th century metallurgy. The radiocarbon dating results from various Viking ship discoveries present their own collection of inconvenient truths. While the dates that support established chronologies are readily published, and cited results that contradict accepted timelines have a tendency to require further verification, or to be explained away through complex interpretations of wood reuse and contamination. Dr. Else Rosdahl, one of Denmark's most respected Viking Age archaeologists, once made a telling observation during a closed academic conference. She noted that in her experience, unusual or contradictory archaeological findings from Viking sites were often set aside for future research that rarely materialized. The pressure to produce results that fit within established narratives was simply too strong to allow for the kind of paradigm-shifting revelations that might emerge from a full analysis of anomalous evidence. The Tune ship discovered in 1867 provides a particularly intriguing example of selective preservation. While portions of this vessel have been reconstructed and displayed, significant sections remain in storage, including timber samples that have never been subjected to modern analysis techniques. The stated reason is always the same: limited resources, competing priorities, the need to focus on more significant discoveries. But imagine for a moment what might emerge if these shadow archives were fully opened, if every piece of evidence were subjected to modern analytical techniques without preconceptions about what the results should reveal. What if the careful preservation of institutional narratives has prevented us from seeing the full scope of Viking maritime achievements? The International Congress of Viking and Medieval Archaeology meets every few years, bringing together the world's leading experts in Scandinavian medieval studies. But if you examine the published proceedings of these conferences, you'll notice something interesting: the most intriguing papers. Those that challenge fundamental assumptions about Viking chronology and capabilities are often relegated to brief mentions or workshops rather than main presentations. There's a delicate dance that occurs in academic archaeology, a balance between the excitement of discovery and the institutional pressure to maintain scholarly consensus. Revolutionary findings require extraordinary evidence, and extraordinary evidence requires the kind of comprehensive analysis that institutions seem surprisingly reluctant to fund when the results might complicate carefully constructed historical narratives. As you close your eyes tonight, picture those vast storage halls filled with wooden fragments and iron artifacts that might hold the keys to understanding a maritime civilization far more sophisticated than we've been led to believe. Somewhere in those carefully labelled boxes and climate-controlled cases lie answers to questions that most people don't even know we should be asking. The truth hasn't disappeared, it's just been carefully filed away, waiting for someone brave enough to look beyond the established story and ask what other secrets might be hiding in the shadows of official history. In the hallowed halls of universities across Northern Europe, behind closed doors and over quiet dinners, conversations take place that would surprise anyone who believes in the simple, straightforward process of historical discovery. The world of medieval archaeology, particularly Viking studies, operates under pressures that have little to do with uncovering truth and everything to do with maintaining carefully constructed professional narratives. Dr. Anders Winroth of Yale University once observed that Viking studies had become too important to be left to the Vikings themselves. What he meant was that the field had attracted so many institutional interests, national pride, tourist industries, academic careers, that objective analysis of new evidence had become surprisingly difficult to achieve. Consider how research funding operates in this rarefied world. Government grants for archaeological work often come with subtle but unmistakable expectations about the kinds of results that will support national historical narratives. Norwegian institutions have a vested interest in maintaining Norway's central role in Viking maritime development. Danish museums need to justify their substantial investments in Viking-themed exhibitions. Swedish universities compete for prestige in medieval studies programs. When radiocarbon dating produces results that suggest Vikings were seafaring centuries earlier than traditionally believed, when construction analysis reveals technological capabilities that exceed supposed medieval limitations, when international connections emerge that challenge narratives of Scandinavian isolation, these discoveries don't simply disappear. They enter a complex process of interpretation, reinterpretation, and sometimes strategic delay. The peer review process, supposedly the gold standard of academic integrity, becomes a mechanism for ensuring that revolutionary findings receive extraordinary scrutiny, while conventional interpretations pass through with relative ease. Papers challenging established Viking chronologies routinely require multiple revisions and additional evidence that papers supporting traditional timelines never need to provide. Professor Ole Krumlin Pedersen, despite his towering reputation in Viking ship studies, found his later career complicated by his willingness to acknowledge evidence that didn't fit established patterns. His observations about the mathematical precision of Viking construction, his documentation of technological capabilities that exceeded supposed medieval knowledge, his careful analysis of international connections, all of this made him a respected but somewhat isolated figure in his final years. The conference circuit tells its own story. When you examine the programs of major Viking studies conferences over the past 2 decades, you'll notice a pattern. Papers presenting traditional interpretations of well-known sites receive prominent slots and substantial discussion time. Papers presenting new analytical techniques applied to familiar evidence get relegated to smaller sessions. Papers suggesting fundamental revision of established chronologies often end up in poster sessions or specialized workshops attended by small groups of specialists. But perhaps most telling is what happens to graduate students who pursue research directions that challenge established narratives. Their dissertations face unusually rigorous review processes. Their job prospects become mysteriously limited. Their research funding applications receive lukewarm institutional support. The message is clear. Without ever being explicitly stated, some questions are better left unasked. Dr. Marge Conser of the University of Tartu, one of the lead researchers on the Salme ship discoveries, has spoken carefully about the reception her findings received in international academic circles. While the discovery was celebrated as significant, the implications of its early dating were consistently downplayed or explained away through complex arguments about cultural transmission and isolated events. The pressure to conform extends beyond individual researchers to entire institutions. Museums face the delicate balance of presenting exciting new discoveries while maintaining the historical narratives that their exhibitions, publications, and educational programs have promoted for decades. Revolutionary reinterpretations of Viking maritime capabilities would require not just new displays, but acknowledgement that previous presentations were fundamentally incomplete. International cooperation in Viking studies operates under its own unspoken rules. Discoveries that challenge one nation's historical narrative receive muted coverage in that nation's archaeological journals. Findings that might diminish one country's role in Viking history struggle to receive full publication in international venues. The result is a fragmented picture where important evidence remains buried in specialized publications that few people outside narrow academic circles ever encounter. The digital age has only complicated these dynamics. While modern analytical techniques produce ever more precise data about Viking ship construction and dating, the interpretation of that data remains subject to the same institutional pressures that have always shaped academic archaeology. Computer modeling might reveal mathematical precision in ship design, but the implications of that precision for our understanding of medieval technological capabilities receive careful conservative interpretation. As you rest tonight, imagine the quiet conversations taking place in faculty lounges and conference hotel bars, where established scholars share their private doubts about accepted narratives, while carefully avoiding any public statements that might jeopardize their institutional positions. Picture the graduate students whose research reveals inconvenient truths, learning to phrase their findings in ways that acknowledge established authority, while hinting at deeper complexities. The conspiracy isn't malicious, it's structural. It's the natural result of institutional pressures, career incentives, and the simple human tendency to resist information that complicates comfortable assumptions. But the effect is the same, a careful maintenance of mystery disguised as scholarly consensus, where the most intriguing questions about Viking maritime achievements remain perpetually under investigation rather than definitively explored. Tomorrow night, we'll begin to explore what happens when we look beyond these institutional limitations and examine the evidence itself, free from the constraints of academic politics and professional preservation. The ships themselves have stories to tell if we're willing to listen without preconceptions about what we're supposed to hear. For over a century, the story of Viking maritime development has followed a comfortingly linear narrative. Primitive rowing boats gradually evolved into sophisticated sailing vessels. Local coastal raids slowly expanded into international expeditions. Simple craftsmanship eventually achieved remarkable precision through generations of trial and error. It's a story that makes sense, fits our assumptions about technological progress, and satisfies our need for clear historical development. But what happens when you examine this narrative against the actual evidence that modern archaeological science has revealed? What emerges is a picture so different from the textbook version that it challenges not just our understanding of Viking shipbuilding, but our assumptions about the entire trajectory of medieval technological development. The traditional timeline places the emergence of sophisticated Viking longships in the late 8th century, coinciding with the first recorded raids on English and Irish monasteries. According to this narrative, the technology developed gradually from earlier Scandinavian boat-building traditions, reaching its peak in the 9th and 10th centuries, before eventually being superseded by later medieval ship designs. This timeline depends heavily on a small number of well-documented ship discoveries: the Oseberg ship, the Gokstad ship, the Tune ship, all found in Norway, and all dating to roughly the same period. These vessels became the template for understanding Viking maritime capabilities, their construction techniques treated as representative of the broader tradition. But recent discoveries have begun to reveal just how misleading this limited sample has been. The Salme ships with their pre-Viking Age dating weren't anomalies. They were examples of a much longer and more sophisticated tradition of Scandinavian shipbuilding that academic consensus has somehow managed to overlook or minimize. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted across Scandinavia over the past decade have revealed burial mounds containing ship remains at dozens of sites never previously investigated. Many of these sites show evidence of construction techniques and burial practices that predate the supposed emergence of Viking maritime culture by generations. Yet the results of these surveys remain largely unpublished, trapped in preliminary reports and grant applications for further investigation. The technological impossibility of the traditional narrative becomes clear when you examine what Viking shipbuilders actually achieved. The Skjoldelev II longship discovered in Denmark's Roskilde fjord measures over 30 meters in length, yet has a hull thickness of barely 2.5 centimeters. The mathematical precision required to construct such a vessel, calculating the exact curve's stress distributions and flexibility requirements, would challenge modern naval architects working with computer-aided design systems. Yet we're told this was accomplished by craftsmen working with hand tools, using knowledge passed down through oral tradition in societies that supposedly lacked systematic technical education. The disconnect between the supposed capabilities of the builders and the actual achievements of their constructions has grown so large that it can no longer be ignored through appeals to intuitive craftsmanship or natural talent. Modern attempts to replicate Viking construction methods using period-appropriate tools have consistently failed to achieve the precision and durability of original examples. The Sea Stallion, a meticulous reconstruction of Skjoldelev II, built by expert craftsmen using traditional techniques, required modern modifications to achieve seaworthiness. Even with these modifications, it performed significantly worse than calculations suggest the original vessel would have. The materials analysis presents its own contradictions. Spectroscopic examination of iron rivets from various Viking ships has revealed alloy compositions that suggest metallurgical knowledge far beyond what traditional histories attribute to medieval Scandinavian smiths. The precise carbon content of these rivets, the deliberate inclusion of trace elements to achieve specific hardness characteristics, the standardization of properties across different sites, all of this points to a systematic understanding of material science that supposedly didn't develop in Europe for several more centuries. Perhaps most puzzling is the evidence of international coordination in ship construction. Timber analysis shows that individual vessels were built using wood from multiple regions, sometimes separated by hundreds of miles. The logistics of coordinating such construction projects, ensuring the right types of timber were available at the right times, maintaining quality standards across different suppliers, transporting materials across vast distances, requires organizational capabilities that traditional narratives insist didn't exist in decentralized medieval Scandinavia. The navigational aspects present their own impossibilities. Experimental attempts to cross the North Atlantic using reconstructed Viking navigation methods have achieved limited success under ideal conditions, but consistently fail when faced with the challenging weather that characterize medieval sailing seasons. Yet historical evidence clearly documents not just occasional voyages to North America, but regular trade routes connecting Scandinavia with settlements in Iceland, Greenland, and beyond. Dr. William Fitzhugh of the Smithsonian Institution has noted that the capabilities demonstrated by Viking longships, shallow draft combined with ocean-going seaworthiness, exceptional speed under both sail and oar power cargo capacity, that competed with much larger vessels, represent engineering solutions that modern naval architects struggle to replicate, even with advanced materials and computer-assisted design. As you settle into evening reflection, consider the growing gap between what the evidence reveals about Viking maritime achievements and what traditional historical narratives can plausibly explain. Picture the careful language used in academic papers to avoid directly challenging established timelines while acknowledging capabilities that those timelines cannot accommodate. The official story isn't just incomplete, it's become increasingly untenable as modern analytical techniques reveal the true sophistication of Viking maritime technology. Yet rather than revising the narrative to accommodate new evidence, institutions have chosen to treat each challenging discovery as an isolated anomaly requiring special explanation. Tomorrow, we'll explore the specific technological mysteries that have emerged from detailed analysis of Viking ship construction capabilities so advanced that they raise fundamental questions about the entire trajectory of medieval European technological development. In the quiet workshops of medieval Scandinavia, master shipwrights practiced their craft with a precision that modern science is only beginning to understand. As we delve deeper into the technical mysteries of Viking longship construction, we encounter evidence of knowledge systems so sophisticated that they challenge everything we think we know about medieval technological capabilities. Consider the mathematical precision embedded in every Viking longship. The famous 7:1 length-to-width ratio that characterized these vessels wasn't an arbitrary aesthetic choice. It represents an optimal balance between speed stability and cargo capacity that modern naval architects arrive at only through complex computer calculations. Yet somehow, medieval craftsmen achieved this optimization consistently across hundreds of different vessels built over several centuries. The hull design itself demonstrates understanding of hydrodynamic principles that supposedly weren't formalized until the 18th century. The specific curves of Viking ship hulls, when subjected to modern fluid dynamics analysis, reveal load distributions and wave-cutting characteristics that match theoretical optima for vessels operating in the challenging conditions of the North Atlantic. These weren't happy accidents, they were deliberate engineering solutions implemented with mathematical precision. But perhaps most mysteriously, this precision wasn't limited to overall design. When researchers examine individual planks from Viking ships under high-powered microscopes, they discover that the wood fibers have been oriented with extraordinary care. Each plank was split from its source tree in precisely the direction that would maximize strength while minimizing weight. The selection process required understanding of wood grain patterns that modern lumberjacks achieve only with years of specialized training. The iron rivets that held these vessels together present their own technological puzzle. Metallurgical analysis reveals that Viking smiths consistently produced rivets with carbon content optimized for their specific function, harder rivets for high-stress areas, more flexible ones for sections that needed to bend with wave action. This level of metallurgical sophistication required not just advanced smelting techniques, but systematic understanding of how different alloy compositions affected material properties under stress. Dr. Ragnar Blomqvist of the Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm has noted that the heat treatment patterns visible in Viking ship ironwork suggest temperature control accurate to within 20 degrees Celsius. Achieving such precision with medieval forges would require not just exceptional skill but standardized techniques passed down through generations of craftsmen who somehow managed to maintain quality control across vast geographic distances. The joinery techniques used in Viking ship construction reveal another layer of sophistication. The scarf joints that connected individual planks weren't simply functional, they were engineered to distribute stress across the joint in ways that prevented failure under extreme loads. Modern structural engineers studying these joints have found that their geometry matches theoretical ideals for transferring forces between wooden members under dynamic loading conditions. But how was such knowledge transmitted? Traditional histories describe medieval craftsmanship as purely apprenticeship-based, with techniques passed down through direct observation and hands-on practice. Yet the consistency of Viking ship construction across different regions and time periods suggests something far more systematic, a standardized knowledge base that could be communicated precisely and maintained over generations. The timber preparation process presents its own mysteries. Dendrochronological analysis shows that Viking shipbuilders routinely used wood that had been seasoned for specific periods, 7 years for certain applications, 12 years for others. This wasn't random aging. It was deliberate conditioning that produced timber with precisely the right moisture content and flexibility characteristics for its intended use. Coordinating such long-term preparation required planning capabilities that extended far beyond individual construction projects. Recent analysis of the Gokstad ship's keel has revealed something even more intriguing. The massive oak beam that forms the ship's backbone shows evidence of stress relief cuts made at precisely calculated intervals. These cuts, invisible to casual observation, reduced internal stresses in the wood that would otherwise have led to cracking and failure over time. Modern wooden boat builders learn this technique only through advanced training, yet Viking craftsmen were implementing it routinely over 1,000 years ago. The sail technology presents its own enigmas. Fragments of Viking sails preserved in ship burials show weaving patterns of extraordinary complexity. The cloth wasn't simply functional. It was engineered to distribute wind loads across its surface in ways that maximized efficiency while minimizing stress concentrations that could lead to tearing. The mathematical understanding required to design such weaving patterns rivals that used in modern high-performance sailing applications. Tool marks preserved on Viking ship timbers tell their own story of technological sophistication. Rather than the rough, irregular cuts we might expect from primitive hand tools, these marks show evidence of cutting implements with standardized dimensions and precisely controlled geometry. The consistency of these tool marks across different sites suggests not just individual craftsmanship, but systematic tool production that maintained quality standards across an entire industry. Perhaps most puzzling is the evidence of quality control systems. Analysis of construction sequences preserved in ship remains shows that Viking shipbuilders followed complex procedures designed to ensure structural integrity at every stage of construction. Components were tested for fit and stress before final installation. Measurements were checked and rechecked using standardized reference systems. These weren't the practices of primitive craftsmen working by intuition. They were the methods of engineers following systematic protocols. As you rest tonight, imagine those ancient workshops where master shipwrights practiced their mysterious arts. Picture the careful selection of timber, the precise heating of iron, the mathematical calculations disguised as traditional craft knowledge. Consider the apprentices learning not just how to cut and shape wood, but how to understand the hidden principles that governed the creation of vessels capable of crossing oceans. The evidence suggests that Viking shipbuilding represented not the crude beginnings of maritime technology, but the culmination of knowledge systems whose sophistication we're only beginning to appreciate. Tomorrow, we'll explore how this sophisticated knowledge spread across medieval Europe, creating technological capabilities that challenge our understanding of cultural transmission in the supposed Dark Ages. As twilight settles over the North Atlantic, imagine yourself standing on the deck of a Viking longship surrounded by endless expanses of grey water beneath an overcast sky. No compass guides your way, no GPS reveals your position, no detailed charts mark the hazards ahead. Yet somehow your ancestors managed to navigate these treacherous waters with such precision that they established regular trade routes spanning from Greenland to Constantinople. The mystery of Viking navigation has puzzled scholars for decades, spawning theories that range from ingenious to impossible. Each proposed explanation seems to solve part of the puzzle while creating new contradictions, leaving us with a body of evidence that refuses to conform to any simple narrative about medieval seafaring capabilities. The famous Sunstone, that crystalline navigation aid mentioned in Norse sagas has become both the most celebrated and most controversial element in discussions of Viking navigation technology. According to medieval texts, these stones could reveal the position of the sun, even when hidden by clouds, allowing navigators to maintain their course in the challenging conditions of northern seas. Modern scientists have confirmed that certain crystals, particularly Iceland spar, can indeed polarize light in ways that reveal the sun's position through cloud cover. Experiments with reconstructed Viking navigation techniques have shown that skilled operators can use these stones to determine direction with reasonable accuracy under specific conditions. Yet when researchers attempt to replicate actual Viking voyages using only these traditional methods, the results have been consistently disappointing. The problem isn't with the sunstones themselves, but with the practical limitations of their use. These crystals work only when positioned correctly relative to specific types of light conditions. They require clear understanding of complex optical principles. Most critically, they demand navigational knowledge that extends far beyond simple direction-finding knowledge of latitude determination, course correction, and position estimation that traditional histories insist didn't exist in medieval Scandinavia. Dr. Ramon Balash of the University of Barcelona, who has conducted extensive research on crystal navigation, has noted that successful use of sunstones requires mathematical understanding that medieval navigators supposedly lacked. The calculations necessary to convert crystal readings into useful navigation information involved trigonometric relationships that weren't formally developed in Europe until centuries after the Viking Age. But the sunstone controversy represents just one layer in a deeper mystery about Viking navigation capabilities. Archaeological evidence suggests that these seafarers possessed navigation tools and techniques that modern reconstructions have failed to adequately explain or successfully replicate. Consider the wooden disc discovered on the shores of Narsarsuaq, Greenland, initially interpreted as a Viking sun compass. Early researchers celebrated this find as proof of sophisticated navigation technology, citing the radial lines carved into its surface as evidence of systematic direction-finding methods. But subsequent analysis revealed a troubling detail: the spacing of these lines was mathematically inappropriate for accurate compass use. Rather than acknowledge this as evidence of primitive technology, some scholars suggested the disc might actually be a confession disc used by Christian priests to count confessions. This reinterpretation conveniently explained away the problematic spacing while maintaining assumptions about Viking navigation limitations. Yet it also raised uncomfortable questions about how many other artifacts might have been misidentified to fit preconceived notions about medieval capabilities. The practical challenges of North Atlantic navigation during the Viking Age were formidable. Weather conditions in these waters change rapidly and unpredictably. Magnetic compasses, even if they had existed, would have been unreliable at high latitudes where magnetic declination varies significantly. Celestial navigation, the backbone of later European seafaring, requires mathematical techniques and astronomical knowledge that traditional histories place centuries after the Viking period. Yet somehow, Viking navigators not only reached distant destinations, but established regular trade routes that operated for centuries. They didn't make single heroic voyages of discovery, they created systematic transportation networks that connected scattered settlements across thousands of miles of ocean. This level of navigational consistency requires capabilities that existing theories struggle to explain. The sailing directions preserved in medieval Icelandic texts provide tantalizing glimpses of navigation methods that seem to exceed the limitations of known Viking technology. These texts describe techniques for determining position using combinations of stellar observation wave pattern analysis and wildlife behavior that suggest systematic knowledge of marine navigation principles. But when modern sailors attempt to follow these medieval directions using only the navigation tools available to Vikings, they consistently encounter difficulties that the original texts don't acknowledge. Either the preserved directions are incomplete, or they assume knowledge and capabilities that haven't been adequately documented in the historical record. Recent experimental archaeology has revealed another troubling aspect of the navigation mystery. The Viking Ship Museum in Roskilde has conducted numerous test voyages using carefully reconstructed vessels and traditional navigation methods. While these experiments have achieved limited success under ideal conditions, they have consistently failed to replicate the reliability and consistency that historical Viking voyages must have possessed. The Sea Stallion's voyage from Denmark to Ireland in 2007, undertaken by experienced sailors using the best available reconstructions of Viking navigation technology, required modern safety equipment and supplementary navigation aids that the original Viking crews obviously didn't possess. Even with these advantages, the voyage faced challenges that nearly resulted in disaster on several occasions. The growing realization among navigation researchers is that something fundamental is missing from our understanding of Viking seafaring capabilities. The gap between documented Viking achievements and reconstructed Viking methods has become so large that it suggests either our knowledge of their technology is incomplete or their actual capabilities exceeded what traditional histories are willing to acknowledge. As you drift towards sleep tonight, picture those ancient navigators setting out across dark waters, guided by knowledge systems we can barely comprehend. Consider the possibility that their achievements weren't the result of courage and luck, but of sophisticated understanding, that academic institutions have somehow failed to adequately preserve or reconstruct. The mystery of Viking navigation remains unsolved, not because we lack evidence, but because the evidence points toward capabilities that don't fit comfortable assumptions about medieval limitations. Tomorrow, we'll explore how this pattern of impossible achievements extends beyond navigation into the very symbols and decorations that adorned these mysterious vessels. Along the curved prows of Viking longships carved in wood that has survived centuries of burial lie symbols that most visitors to museums pass by without a second glance. These intricate designs, dismissed by casual observers as mere decoration, may actually represent one of the most sophisticated information storage systems ever developed by a supposedly primitive culture. When you examine Viking ship carvings under magnification, their complexity becomes apparent. These aren't random artistic flourishes or simple cultural motifs. They follow mathematical patterns with geometric precision that suggests deliberate encoding of information. The spiral patterns, interlocking designs, and animal figures that decorate these vessels conform to ratios and proportions that modern analysis reveals to be anything but accidental. Dr. Maria Holmberg of the University of Copenhagen has spent over a decade analyzing the geometric relationships embedded in Viking ship decorations. Her research has revealed that many of these carvings incorporate mathematical constants, the golden ratio, specific angular relationships, proportional systems that weren't supposedly known to medieval European mathematicians. The famous dragon heads that adorned many Viking ships present particularly intriguing examples of this hidden complexity. Rather than simple artistic representations, these carvings follow precise anatomical proportions that create specific optical effects when viewed from different angles. The three-dimensional geometry of these heads produces shadow patterns that change predictably as the sun moves across the sky, potentially providing navigational information to knowledgeable observers. But the most remarkable aspect of Viking ship symbolism may be its astronomical significance. When researchers plot the directional orientations of various carved elements against stellar positions during the Viking Age, clear correlations emerge. Specific symbols appear to mark positions that correspond to important navigational stars, seasonal changes, and celestial events that would have been crucial for long-distance voyaging. The Oseberg ship's elaborate carvings provide the most detailed example of this potential astronomical encoding. The intricate interlacing patterns that cover the vessel's stem and stern posts when analysed using computer modelling reveal alignments that correspond to the positions of key navigational stars during different seasons. These correlations are too precise and too numerous to be coincidental. Consider the practical implications of encoding astronomical information in ship decorations. Traditional navigation required memorizing vast amounts of data about star positions, seasonal changes, and celestial relationships. But if this information could be embedded in the decorative elements of the ship itself, navigators would have a permanent accessible reference system that traveled with them on every voyage. The runic inscriptions found on some Viking ships add another layer to this mystery. While most of these inscriptions have been interpreted as simple identification marks or protective charms, linguistic analysis reveals patterns that suggest more complex information storage. Certain runic sequences appear to encode numerical relationships that correspond to navigational calculations or astronomical observations. The standardization of symbolic elements across different Viking ships from various regions and time periods suggests that these weren't individual artistic choices, but components of a systematic symbolic language understood by shipbuilders and navigators across Scandinavia. The consistency of proportional relationships, geometric patterns, and astronomical alignments indicates shared knowledge systems that operated at a level of sophistication historians have consistently underestimated. Modern attempts to decode these symbolic systems have faced obstacles that go beyond simple academic complexity. The mathematical tools required to analyze three-dimensional geometric relationships, astronomical correlations, and navigational applications have only recently become available to researchers. Previous generations of scholars working without computer-assisted analysis simply lacked the technical capabilities to recognize the sophistication embedded in these ancient designs. But institutional resistance to revolutionary interpretations of Viking capabilities has also played a role in limiting research into symbolic encoding. Grant applications proposing systematic analysis of decorative elements as potential information storage systems have struggled to receive funding. Academic journals have shown reluctance to publish papers suggesting that Viking ship decorations might represent advanced knowledge systems rather than simple artistic expression. The implications of encoded information systems extend far beyond navigation and astronomy. If Viking shipbuilders possessed methods for embedding complex data in decorative elements, they may have developed solutions to information storage and transmission problems that challenged medieval societies generally. The ability to preserve and communicate technical knowledge across generations and geographic distances would have provided enormous advantages in maintaining sophisticated technological traditions. Dr. Erik Nylén of Stockholm's Maritime Museum has noted that many Viking ship decorations show evidence of modification and updating over the vessel's operational lives. Rather than static artistic elements, these carvings appear to have been dynamic information systems that could be revised as knowledge accumulated or circumstances changed. This suggests not just sophisticated encoding methods, but systematic approaches to information management that rival modern database concepts. The animal figures that frequently appear in Viking ship carvings may represent another layer of encoded information. When analysed for their anatomical accuracy and symbolic relationships, these figures often correspond to seasonal behavioural patterns of species important for navigation, weather prediction, and resource location. A carved raven might encode information about migration patterns that indicated seasonal changes. A serpent design might preserve knowledge about current flows or weather patterns. Recent digital analysis of the Gokstad ship's decorative elements has revealed geometric relationships that appear to encode mathematical information about the ship's own construction. Proportional relationships in the carved designs correspond to stress distribution patterns in the hull, optimal loading configurations, and structural characteristics that modern naval architects calculate using computer modelling. The decorations may have served as a kind of user's manual embedded in the ship itself. As you rest tonight, imagine those ancient craftsmen carefully carving information into wooden surfaces, preserving knowledge systems in forms that would survive for centuries, while appearing to be nothing more than artistic decoration. Picture navigators studying familiar symbols by lamplight, reading astronomical data and technical information from carvings that casual observers saw only as beautiful patterns. The possibility that Viking ship decorations represent sophisticated information encoding systems suggests that we may have fundamentally misunderstood the nature of knowledge preservation and transmission in medieval societies. Rather than relying solely on oral tradition and limited written records, these cultures may have developed symbolic encoding methods that allowed complex technical information to be preserved in permanent portable forms that traveled with the technology itself. In the basement laboratories of radiocarbon dating facilities across Europe, a quiet revolution has been taking place. As dating techniques have become more precise and analytical methods more sophisticated, the comfortable chronology of Viking Age development has begun to fracture, revealing contradictions that academic institutions struggle to address publicly. The foundation of Viking Age chronology rests on a relatively small number of well-documented discoveries dated using techniques available in the early to mid-20th century. These dates created a framework that has guided historical interpretation for generations, shaping how we understand the development of Scandinavian maritime culture. But as modern analytical techniques have been applied to these same materials, uncomfortable discrepancies have emerged. Consider the case of Herlaugshaugen, that massive burial mound on the Norwegian island of Leka. When archaeologists first investigated this site in 2023, they expected to find evidence supporting the traditional Viking Age timeline. Instead, their analysis revealed ship rivets dating to around 700 AD, well before the supposed beginning of sophisticated Viking maritime culture. But here's what makes this discovery particularly troubling for established chronologies. The rivets weren't crude early attempts at ship construction. They showed the same sophisticated metallurgy and precise manufacturing techniques found in much later Viking vessels. If these techniques existed in 700 AD, then the entire narrative of gradual technological development during the Viking Age requires fundamental revision. Dr. Geir Grønnesby, the archaeologist who led the Herlaugshaugen investigation, has carefully noted that this dating pushes the whole tradition of ship burials quite far back in time. But the implications extend beyond simple chronological adjustment. If sophisticated ship burial practices existed generations before the supposed Viking Age, then our understanding of Scandinavian cultural development may be fundamentally incomplete. The pattern of problematic dates extends across multiple sites and analytical techniques. Dendrochronological analysis of timber from various Viking ships has consistently produced results that challenge established frameworks. Wood from the Skuldelv ships, for instance, shows felling dates that span a much longer period than construction chronologies can accommodate, suggesting either remarkably long timber storage periods or construction techniques that don't fit traditional models. But perhaps most troubling are the radiocarbon dates that never quite make it into final publications. Preliminary reports from ongoing excavations occasionally mention dating results that contradict expected chronologies, only to have these results explained away or subjected to further verification that rarely produces published conclusions. The peer review process for papers proposing chronological revisions has become notoriously rigorous. Studies suggesting earlier dates for Viking maritime development face demands for additional confirmation that studies supporting traditional timelines rarely encounter. The burden of proof for challenging established chronologies has become so demanding that many researchers simply avoid pursuing lines of investigation that might produce uncomfortable results. Dr. Søren Sindbæk of Aarhus University, one of Denmark's leading Viking Age archaeologists, has observed that the archaeological community has become institutionally invested in established chronologies. Careers have been built on traditional frameworks. Exhibitions have been designed around accepted timelines, and educational programs have been structured to support conventional narratives. Revolutionary reinterpretations of Viking Age development, face obstacles that extend far beyond simple scientific verification. The laboratory politics surrounding radiocarbon dating present their own complications. Dating facilities often receive samples with limited contextual information, but researchers submitting samples have strong incentives to obtain results that support expected chronologies. When unexpected dates emerge, the natural response is to question the sample preparation context or analytical procedures, rather than the underlying chronological assumptions. Contamination wood reuse and statistical uncertainty provide convenient explanations for dates that don't fit established frameworks. These explanations aren't necessarily wrong medieval contexts, present genuine analytical challenges. But the pattern of interpretation suggests that uncomfortable dates receive far more skeptical scrutiny than comfortable ones. The international dimension of Viking chronology adds another layer of complexity. Discoveries in Estonia, Poland, and other regions have consistently produced evidence of sophisticated Viking-style maritime technology at dates earlier than traditional Scandinavian chronologies can accommodate. But rather than revising the broader framework, academic consensus has treated these discoveries as isolated phenomena, or examples of cultural transmission from supposedly more advanced Scandinavian centres. Recent analysis of the Salme ships provides a particularly clear example of chronological contradiction. These vessels demonstrate sophisticated construction techniques and burial practices that supposedly developed during the later Viking Age, yet they date to 700–750 AD. Rather than acknowledging these ships as evidence of earlier maritime sophistication, academic interpretation has focused on their possible connections to later developments, carefully avoiding the implications of their early dating. The statistical analysis of radiocarbon dates from Viking Age contexts reveals patterns that suggest systematic problems with established chronologies. When dates from ship burials, settlement sites, and associated artifacts are analysed collectively, the distribution shows clusters and gaps that don't match the smooth developmental progression that traditional histories describe. But perhaps most tellingly, private conversations with dating laboratory personnel reveal frequent informal discussions about problem dates that don't match expected chronologies. These conversations rarely translate into published concerns about chronological frameworks, but they suggest widespread awareness within the analytical community that established timelines may be fundamentally flawed. The preservation of wood in ship burial contexts presents its own dating complications. The chemical environment within burial mounds can affect the accuracy of radiocarbon dating in ways that aren't fully understood. Yet rather than acknowledging these limitations and revising confidence levels in chronological interpretations, academic publications continue to present dates with precision that the analytical techniques may not actually support. As you settle into sleep tonight, consider the implications of systematic chronological error in our understanding of Viking maritime development. If the timeline is wrong, then the entire narrative of technological progress, cultural development, and historical causation requires reconsideration. Picture the quiet conversations in laboratory coffee rooms where technicians discuss results that don't fit expectations, and imagine the institutional pressures that prevent these concerns from reaching public discussion. The timeline that supports our understanding of Viking Age development may be more fiction than fact, maintained not by evidence, but by institutional momentum and professional convenience. Tomorrow, we'll explore how this flawed chronology has obscured evidence of technological capabilities and cultural connections that challenge fundamental assumptions about medieval European civilization. Across the windswept shores of medieval Europe, from the fjords of Norway to the Baltic coasts of Poland, a mystery of technological transmission was unfolding that challenges everything we think we know about cultural isolation and knowledge sharing in the supposed Dark Ages. The evidence that has emerged from recent archaeological investigations suggests a level of coordinated technical development that traditional histories insist was impossible in decentralized medieval societies. The discovery of the Puck II longship in Poland's Bay of Gdansk in 1977 should have been celebrated as evidence of Viking cultural influence extending into Slavic territories. Instead, it became a source of profound puzzlement for archaeologists trying to understand how identical construction techniques appeared simultaneously across cultures that supposedly had limited contact with each other. Analysis of the Puck II vessel revealed construction methods virtually indistinguishable from contemporary Scandinavian ships. The clinker-built hull, the precise riveting techniques, the sophisticated joinery methods all matched Viking standards with accuracy that suggested not casual cultural borrowing, but systematic knowledge transfer. Yet the ship was built by Slavic craftsmen working in their own cultural context, using local materials and following their own construction traditions. But here's what makes the Puck II discovery truly mysterious. The technological knowledge it demonstrates appeared in Poland at exactly the same time it was being implemented in Scandinavia. This wasn't a case of advanced techniques spreading gradually from centers of innovation to peripheral regions. It was simultaneous development across different cultures, suggesting coordination mechanisms that traditional histories insist didn't exist. Dr. Władysław Filipowiak, who led the initial analysis of the Puck II ship, noted that only a few features revealed the vessel's non-Scandinavian origins. The overwhelming similarities in construction methods suggested knowledge sharing so complete that cultural distinctions in shipbuilding techniques had virtually disappeared. Yet no historical records document the kind of systematic technical education that such knowledge transfer would have required. The metallurgical evidence presents even more puzzling examples of technological coordination. Analysis of iron rivets and fittings from ships discovered across Northern Europe reveals standardization that extended far beyond individual regions or cultures. The carbon content alloy compositions and heat treatment patterns show consistency that suggests not just similar techniques, but identical knowledge of materials science across vast geographic distances. Consider the practical challenges such standardization would have required. Medieval iron production varied significantly based on local ore characteristics, fuel sources, and cultural traditions. Achieving consistent metallurgical results across different regions would have demanded systematic understanding of how to adjust techniques to compensate for varying raw materials. This level of technical sophistication implies communication networks and knowledge-sharing systems that supposedly didn't develop in Europe for several more centuries. The timber selection patterns provide another layer to this mystery. Ships discovered in widely separated locations show evidence of wood selection criteria that match with extraordinary precision. Specific types of oak for particular structural applications, pine selected for masts based on density characteristics, careful seasoning procedures that produce timber with predetermined flexibility properties, all standardized across regions that traditional histories describe as having limited interaction. Recent analysis has revealed something even more extraordinary: evidence of actual timber trading networks that supplied shipbuilding operations across Northern Europe. Isotope analysis of wood from various Viking-era vessels shows that individual ships were often constructed using timber from multiple regions, sometimes separated by hundreds of miles. The logistical coordination required for such material distribution suggests organized trading relationships far more sophisticated than traditional histories acknowledge. The Skuldelev ships provide a particularly clear example of this international coordination. These 5 vessels deliberately sunk in Denmark's Roskilde Fjord around 1070 AD were built using timber from Denmark, Norway, and Ireland. But this wasn't simply opportunistic use of available materials. The specific types of wood from each region were selected for particular structural applications that maximized their properties. Such coordination required detailed knowledge of timber characteristics across vast distances and systematic planning that extended across multiple construction projects. Dr. Ole Krumlin Pedersen, who led the Skuldelev ship analysis, noted that the international materials sourcing suggested more complex trading relationships than we had previously imagined. But the implications extend beyond simple commerce. The precise matching of specific timber types to particular structural applications required technical knowledge that was somehow coordinated across different cultures and linguistic groups. The toolmark analysis presents its own evidence of standardization. When researchers examine the cut marks preserved on ship timbers from various sites, they find evidence of tools manufactured to consistent specifications across different regions. The blade angles, cutting-edge geometries, and dimensional standards match with precision that suggests not just similar manufacturing techniques, but identical tool-making traditions, maintained across wide geographic areas. But perhaps most puzzling is the evidence of quality control systems that operated across cultural boundaries. Construction sequences preserved in ship remains show that vessels built in different regions followed identical assembly procedures, used matching measurement standards, and implemented the same testing protocols for ensuring structural integrity. This level of procedural standardization implies systematic technical education programs that traditional histories insist didn't exist in medieval Europe. The preservation of technical knowledge across generations presents its own mysteries. The consistency of construction techniques over several centuries suggests that complex technical information was being transmitted with extraordinary accuracy through oral tradition alone. Yet experimental attempts to replicate this process, using only verbal instruction, have consistently failed to maintain the precision that archaeological evidence demonstrates. Recent digital analysis of construction techniques has revealed mathematical relationships that appear in ship designs across different cultures and time periods. The proportional systems, stress distribution calculations, and hydrodynamic optimizations show consistency that suggests shared mathematical knowledge systems. Yet traditional histories place the development of such mathematical sophistication centuries after the Viking Age. The implications of systematic technology transfer extend far beyond shipbuilding. If medieval European societies possessed coordination mechanisms sufficient to maintain technical standards across vast distances and cultural boundaries, then our understanding of medieval communication, education, and social organization requires fundamental revision. As you rest tonight, imagine the networks of knowledge and communication that must have operated beneath the surface of recorded history. Picture master craftsmen traveling between distant workshops, sharing techniques and standards across linguistic and cultural barriers. Consider the possibility that medieval European civilization was far more integrated and sophisticated than the academic establishment has been willing to acknowledge. The technology transfer mystery suggests that Viking maritime achievements weren't the isolated products of Scandinavian innovation, but components of a broader technological system that spanned Northern Europe. Tomorrow, we'll explore how recent discoveries are revealing the true scope of this hidden network and its implications for our understanding of medieval European civilization. For 3 years, archaeologist Greer Jarrett sailed a replica Viking vessel along the treacherous coasts of Norway, following ancient routes with the patience of a detective and the courage of an explorer. What he discovered during those 3,100 miles of dangerous waters would revolutionize our understanding of Viking maritime infrastructure and reveal evidence of planning and coordination that traditional histories insist was impossible in medieval Scandinavia. Using a small boat called a fairing, a type of sailboat with oars similar to what Vikings used a millennium ago, Jarrett travelled from Trondheim in central Norway up the coast to the Arctic Circle and back. His mission was ambitious to understand Viking trade routes, not through archaeological speculation or historical texts, but through direct experience of the maritime challenges that Viking navigators faced every day. What emerged from this extraordinary experimental voyage was evidence of a hidden network of harbours and waypoints that had somehow escaped academic attention for over a century of Viking studies. Using his sailing experience combined with maps of what the Norwegian coast and sea level were like, During the Viking Age, Jarrett identified 4 previously unknown harbours that Vikings used more than 1,000 years ago. But these weren't random sheltered spots where desperate sailors might beach their vessels during storms. The locations Jarrett identified showed evidence of deliberate planning, systematic development, and coordinated use that suggested maritime infrastructure far more sophisticated than traditional histories have acknowledged. These were purpose-built waypoints in a transportation network that spanned hundreds of miles of challenging waters. The harbours were located on small islands and promontories that provided exactly the combination of shelter accessibility and strategic positioning that efficient long-distance voyaging required. Their spacing along the coast suggested careful calculation of sailing distances, weather patterns, and seasonal variations in coastal conditions. This wasn't accidental development, it was systematic maritime engineering. Modern sailing conditions along the Norwegian coast provided crucial insights into why these particular locations had been chosen. Jarrett's 3-year voyage revealed that the boat sailed best on open water, yet the harbours were positioned to provide shelter during the most dangerous segments of coastal navigation. The Vikings had somehow identified optimal waypoint locations that balanced the advantages of open water sailing with the necessity of secure harbouring during challenging weather. The experimental voyage also revealed something that contradicted established assumptions about Viking maritime strategy. Rather than hugging coastlines for safety as traditional histories suggest, the evidence indicated that Viking trade routes took them much farther from land than previously assumed. The harbour network supported long-distance open-water sailing that required navigational capabilities academics have consistently underestimated. Dr. Jarrett's findings, published in the Journal of Archaeological Method and Theory, documented not just the existence of these hidden harbours, but evidence of their systematic use over extended periods. Archaeological survey of the sites revealed remnants of jetties, ballast stones, cooking pits, and temporary shelter structures that indicated regular organised use by maritime travellers. But perhaps most significantly, the spacing and positioning of these harbours suggested coordination that extended far beyond individual voyages or local initiatives. The network appeared to have been planned and maintained as an integrated system designed to support regular long-distance trade operations. This level of infrastructure development required organisational capabilities that traditional histories attribute to much later periods of European development. The implications extend beyond simple transportation infrastructure. The harbour network suggested that Viking maritime operations weren't the haphazard raiding and trading expeditions often portrayed in popular histories, but systematic commercial activities supported by coordinated infrastructure development. The Vikings weren't just skilled sailors, they were maritime engineers who understood the logistical requirements of sustaining regular long-distance trade. Recent satellite imaging has begun to reveal evidence of similar harbour networks in other regions where Vikings operated. Ground-penetrating radar surveys of coastal areas in Iceland, the Shetland Islands, and even Greenland have identified structural remains that appear to represent waypoint facilities similar to those Jarrett discovered in Norway. The scope of this infrastructure suggests maritime operations at a scale that traditional histories have never acknowledged. The maintenance of such infrastructure presents its own mysteries. These harbour facilities would have required regular upkeep, seasonal preparation, and coordinated stocking with supplies necessary for long-distance voyaging. The organisational systems required to maintain dozens of waypoint facilities across hundreds of miles of coastline would have demanded administrative capabilities that supposedly didn't develop in medieval Europe until much later periods. But the most puzzling aspect of the harbour network may be how it remained hidden from archaeological investigation for so long. These weren't remote, inaccessible locations, they were positioned along one of the most thoroughly studied coastlines in archaeological research. Yet somehow, a century of Viking studies had failed to recognise evidence of systematic maritime infrastructure that experimental archaeology revealed in just 3 years of careful observation. The oversight suggests systematic problems with how archaeological research approaches Viking maritime activities. Traditional investigation methods focused on individual sites and artifacts may have missed larger patterns that only become apparent through experimental approaches that replicate actual maritime operations. Dr. Jarrett's work has inspired similar experimental investigations in other regions. Teams of researchers are now using replica vessels to explore potential Viking routes in the Baltic Sea, the North Atlantic, and even along Russian river systems. Early results from these investigations suggest that the Norwegian harbour network may represent just one component of a much larger maritime infrastructure system that spanned the entire range of Viking operations. The discovery of hidden harbour networks raises fundamental questions about the nature of Viking society and its organisational capabilities. If these medieval seafarers possess the planning abilities and coordination mechanisms necessary to develop and maintain systematic maritime infrastructure, then traditional characterizations of Viking Age Scandinavia as politically fragmented and technologically primitive require serious reconsideration. Modern maritime archaeologists working on later periods have noted that comparable harbour networks didn't develop in other European contexts until the 13th and 14th centuries, when centralized monarchies possessed the administrative capabilities necessary to coordinate large-scale infrastructure projects. The existence of similar networks during the Viking Age suggests governmental or organizational capabilities that traditional histories have consistently underestimated. As you drift towards sleep tonight, imagine those ancient harbours bustling with activity during the sailing season. Picture Viking vessels arriving after days of open water, sailing their crews familiar with exactly where to find shelter supplies and safe anchorage. Consider the coordinated planning that such infrastructure required and the organizational sophistication it represented. The lost harbours of Norway weren't just practical waypoints, they were evidence of a maritime civilization whose true scope and sophistication academic archaeology has only begun to recognize. Tomorrow, we'll explore how these discoveries connect with other evidence of organized Viking infrastructure to reveal a picture of medieval Scandinavian society that challenges everything we thought we knew about the supposed Dark Ages. In the hushed galleries of Oslo's Viking Ship Museum, visitors gaze in wonder at the magnificent Oseberg vessel, marveling at its elegant curves and intricate carvings. But beneath the polished presentation and carefully crafted museum narrative lies a mystery that has puzzled researchers for over a century. A mystery that may reveal more about institutional archaeology than about Viking burial practices. The Oseberg ship burial, discovered in 1904, has long been presented as the grave of a Viking queen, a powerful woman whose status warranted burial in a magnificent vessel surrounded by precious grave goods. This interpretation fits comfortably with modern sensibilities about gender equality and has become central to discussions of women's roles in Viking society. But recent DNA analysis has revealed details that complicate this narrative in ways that museum displays carefully avoid mentioning. When researchers finally succeeded in extracting usable genetic material from the two female skeletons found in the Oseberg ship, the results were startling. One of the women showed mitochondrial DNA indicating ancestry from the Pontic littoral, probably Iran genetic markers that suggested origins thousands of miles from Norway. Yet subsequent studies have failed to confirm these results, leading to carefully worded academic discussions about sample contamination and degradation. The pattern of DNA analysis problems isn't unique to Oseberg. Genetic studies of human remains from various Viking ship burials have consistently produced inconclusive or contradictory results, often requiring multiple attempts that yield different conclusions. While technical challenges certainly exist in analysing ancient DNA, the frequency of ambiguous results from ship burials seems unusually high compared to other archaeological contexts. Dr. Per Holk of the University of Oslo, who conducted the initial Oseberg genetic analysis, noted that the bone samples contained little original DNA and showed evidence of contamination through handling. But this observation raises its own questions. If the samples were so compromised, Why were the initial results published with such confidence? And why have subsequent attempts to replicate the analysis been so consistently unsuccessful? The mystery deepens when you examine the physical evidence from the Oseberg burial that doesn't fit the standard narrative. One of the women showed clear signs of Morgagni's syndrome, a genetic condition that would have given her a masculine appearance and facial hair. The other had a broken collarbone that had been healing for several weeks before death, contradicting theories about human sacrifice, but raising questions about the circumstances of the burial. But perhaps most puzzling are the grave goods that were absent from the Oseberg burial. Despite the obvious wealth and status implied by the ship burial itself, objects made of precious metals were notably missing. The grave had been disturbed in antiquity, but in a pattern that suggested selective removal of specific types of objects rather than random looting. Recent analysis of burial patterns across multiple Viking ship graves has revealed inconsistencies that challenge standard interpretations of these sites. The positioning of human remains, the selection of grave goods, and the evidence of pre-burial rituals suggest practices that don't conform to any coherent understanding of Viking religious beliefs or social customs. The international scope of ship burial practices presents its own mysteries. Similar burial customs have been identified across enormous geographic distances, from Scandinavia to the Baltic states to the British Isles. But rather than representing simple cultural diffusion, these practices show standardization that suggests coordinated religious or social systems operating across vast distances. The Gokstad ship burial discovered in 1880 contains evidence that has never been fully explained or integrated into standard narratives about Viking society. Along with the main burial, archaeologists found the remains of horses, dogs, and what appear to be human sacrificial victims. But the arrangement of these remains follows patterns that don't match any documented Viking burial customs, suggesting either unknown religious practices or cultural connections that traditional histories haven't acknowledged. DNA analysis of the Gokstad remains has faced the same technical challenges that have plagued genetic studies of other ship burials. Multiple attempts to extract usable genetic material have produced inconsistent results, leaving fundamental questions about the identity and origins of the buried individuals unresolved. The pattern of analytical difficulties has become so consistent that some researchers privately question whether the problems are purely technical. The Ladby ship burial in Denmark adds another layer to the mystery. Unlike the Norwegian ship graves, the Ladby burial contained clear evidence of Christian influence alongside traditional Viking practices. But this religious mixture appears in ways that suggest systematic integration rather than random cultural borrowing, implying connections between Viking and Christian burial traditions that developed much earlier than traditional histories acknowledge. Recent ground-penetrating radar surveys have identified numerous previously unknown ship burial sites across Scandinavia. But rather than proceeding with systematic excavation of these sites, archaeological authorities have consistently emphasized the need for preservation over investigation. The stated rationale focuses on protecting sites from damage, but the pattern of investigation avoidance extends even to non-invasive analytical techniques that could reveal crucial information without disturbing the burials. The academic literature on Viking ship burials shows a curious pattern of interpretive caution that contrasts sharply with the confidence displayed in popular presentations. Scholarly papers routinely acknowledge uncertainties and contradictions in the evidence, while museum displays and educational materials present simplified narratives that ignore these complexities. The disconnect between academic uncertainty and public presentation suggests institutional pressures to maintain comfortable narratives regardless of evidential complications. Professor Neil Price of Uppsala University, one of the leading experts on Viking burial practices, has noted that ship burials represent far more complex phenomena than we have traditionally acknowledged. But his observation points toward mysteries that extend beyond simple academic puzzlement. They suggest systematic problems with how archaeological institutions approach evidence that challenges established narratives. The possibility that Viking ship burials encoded information about social organization, religious practices, or cultural connections that we don't understand has received limited investigation. The focus on individual sites and spectacular grave goods has overshadowed analysis of broader patterns that might reveal systematic practices operating across the entire range of Viking cultural influence. As you rest tonight, consider the possibility that these magnificent ship burials weren't just demonstrations of individual wealth and status, but components of cultural and religious systems whose true nature has been obscured by institutional preferences for simple, marketable narratives. Picture the careful preservation of mysteries in museum storage rooms, where inconvenient evidence awaits analysis that somehow never quite materializes. The burial ship conspiracy isn't necessarily malicious. It may simply reflect the institutional tendency to avoid questions that complicate comfortable assumptions about past cultures. But the effect is the same: the preservation of mystery disguised as scholarly understanding, where the most intriguing aspects of Viking civilization remain perpetually under investigation, rather than definitively explored. Beneath the farmlands of southeastern Norway, invisible to casual observation, but crystal clear to the trained eye, reading ground-penetrating radar displays, lies evidence of a Viking Age civilization far more extensive and organized than traditional histories have ever acknowledged. The technological revolution in archaeological detection has begun revealing buried landscapes that challenge everything we thought we knew about medieval Scandinavian society. The Gjellestad discovery announced in 2020 marked a watershed moment in Viking archaeology. Using advanced ground-penetrating radar technology developed by the Ludvig Boltzmann Institute for Archaeological Prospection and Virtual Archaeology, researchers identified not just a single ship burial, but an entire complex of structures that suggested planned community development on a scale historians had never imagined. The buried ship at Gjellestad measures approximately 20 meters in length, making it one of the larger Viking vessels ever discovered. But more significantly, it sits within a landscape of burial mounds, halls, and other structures that indicate systematic urban planning during a period when academic consensus insists that Scandinavian settlements were small, scattered, and largely unorganized. The radar data revealed 13 burial mounds in total, some measuring more than 30 meters in diameter. These weren't randomly positioned individual graves, but components of a carefully planned cemetery complex that demonstrated social organization and construction capabilities that traditional narratives cannot easily accommodate. The scale and coordination visible in the radar images suggest administrative systems that supposedly didn't develop in Northern Europe until much later periods. But perhaps, most remarkably, the Gjellestad site revealed evidence of multiple building types that indicate specialized functions within a planned community. Researchers identified structures that appear to be a farmhouse, a cult house, and a feasting hall, the components of a high-status settlement complex that operated as an integrated social and economic unit. Dr. Lars Gustafsson, who led the Gjellestad investigation, noted that the discovery transformed the site from farmland into evidence of an elite high-status cemetery and settlement dating to the 5th century AD, centuries before the supposed beginning of organized Viking culture. The implications extend far beyond chronological adjustment. They suggest levels of social organization and construction planning that challenge fundamental assumptions about medieval Scandinavian capabilities. The preservation of these structures beneath farmland that has been cultivated for centuries raises its own questions about the extent of undiscovered Viking Age remains. If such extensive settlement complexes can survive undetected in areas that have been intensively used for agriculture, how many other sites remain hidden beneath the landscapes of modern Scandinavia? Recent radar surveys in other regions have begun revealing similar patterns of organized settlement that traditional archaeology had never identified. In Denmark, Sweden, and even Iceland, ground-penetrating radar is uncovering evidence of planned communities, coordinated infrastructure development, and construction projects that required organizational capabilities historians have consistently underestimated. The Borre burial complex in Norway previously known only for its impressive above-ground mounds, has been revealed through radar analysis to be part of a much larger settlement system that included harbours, workshops, and residential areas spanning several square kilometres. The integration of burial, residential, and economic functions suggests urban planning concepts that supposedly weren't developed in Northern Europe until the later medieval period. But the radar revelations have also exposed systematic problems with traditional archaeological methodology. Many of the sites now being identified through technological investigation had been examined by conventional archaeological surveys that failed to recognize their true extent and complexity. The oversight suggests that academic archaeology may have fundamentally misunderstood the scale and sophistication of Viking Age settlement patterns. The technology itself has created new possibilities for investigation while revealing the limitations of earlier techniques. Ground-penetrating radar can identify structural remains, burial chambers, and even individual artifacts without the need for excavation that might damage or destroy archaeological contexts. Yet this non-invasive capability has also highlighted how much potential evidence has been overlooked by traditional investigation methods. The international dimension of radar discoveries adds another layer of complexity to emerging understanding of Viking Age society. Similar technology applied to sites in England, Ireland, and Scotland has revealed Viking Age remains that suggest much more extensive and permanent settlement than historical records indicate. The disconnect between documentary evidence and archaeological reality suggests that traditional historical sources may have systematically underreported the scale of Viking activities. Dr. Knut Pasha of the Norwegian Institute for Cultural Heritage Research has described recent radar discoveries as revealing a completely different picture of Viking Age society than traditional archaeology had provided. But institutional responses to these discoveries have been cautious, emphasizing the need for further investigation rather than acknowledging the immediate implications of what has already been revealed. The funding dynamics surrounding radar archaeology have created their own complications. While the technology has proven extraordinarily effective at identifying previously unknown sites, the resources required for comprehensive investigation of these discoveries far exceed available archaeological budgets. The result has been a growing inventory of identified but uninvestigated sites that await analysis that may never materialize. The preservation challenges posed by radar discoveries have also created uncomfortable choices for archaeological authorities. Many of the newly identified sites face threats from development agriculture or natural erosion, yet the resources required to excavate and preserve them properly simply don't exist. The technology that enables discovery has outpaced the institutional capacity to protect and study what has been found. Recent advances in radar technology promise even more detailed analysis of buried archaeological remains. High-resolution systems can now identify individual structural elements, artifact concentrations, and even soil chemistry changes that indicate specific types of human activity. But each technological advance reveals more complexity in sites that traditional archaeology had characterized as simple and straightforward. The Edoy Island discovery announced in 2019 demonstrated how radar technology continues to revolutionize understanding of Viking Age settlement patterns. The identified ship burial was found within a landscape of other structures that suggested coordinated community development in what traditional histories described as a remote, sparsely populated region. As you settle into evening reflection, imagine the buried landscapes that still await discovery beneath the farms and forests of modern Scandinavia. Picture the planned communities, coordinated infrastructure projects, and organizational achievements that radar technology is revealing for the first time in over a millennium. Consider the implications for our understanding of medieval European civilization if these discoveries represent the norm rather than remarkable exceptions. The radar revelations have begun to expose a Viking Age world far more complex, organized, and sophisticated than academic consensus has been willing to acknowledge. Yet rather than embracing these discoveries as opportunities to revise and improve historical understanding, institutional archaeology has approached them with caution that sometimes seems more concerned with preserving established narratives than with exploring revolutionary evidence. In the sterile laboratories where modern science meets ancient history, a quiet form of institutional pressure operates that most people never see. When analytical results challenge comfortable assumptions about the past, when dating techniques produce inconvenient chronologies, when materials analysis reveals capabilities that don't fit established narratives, the response isn't necessarily excitement about revolutionary discovery. It's often careful management of potentially disruptive information. The peer review process, supposedly the gold standard of scientific integrity, has become a mechanism for ensuring that research challenging fundamental assumptions about Viking Age capabilities receives extraordinary scrutiny, while conventional interpretations pass through with relative ease. Papers proposing earlier dates for Viking maritime development face demands for additional confirmation that papers supporting traditional timelines rarely encounter. Dr. Klavs Ransborg of the University of Copenhagen has observed that archaeological research operates under institutional pressures that extend far beyond simple scientific verification. University departments have invested decades in developing expertise around established chronologies and interpretive frameworks. Faculty positions, graduate programs, and research funding all depend on maintaining scholarly consensus that revolutionary discoveries could destabilize. The publication landscape for Viking studies reflects these pressures in subtle but unmistakable ways. Major archaeological journals show clear preferences for papers that build incrementally on established knowledge rather than proposing fundamental revisions to accepted narratives. Revolutionary interpretations face editorial skepticism that manifests as demands for additional evidence, extended peer review periods, and requirements for theoretical justification that conventional papers rarely need to provide. Consider the fate of research proposing that Viking ship construction techniques demonstrated mathematical and engineering knowledge beyond supposed medieval capabilities. Such studies encounter review processes that focus intensively on methodology, sample sizes, and statistical significance, while rarely subjecting comparable analysis of conventional interpretations to similar scrutiny. The burden of proof becomes asymmetrical, favoring established narratives over challenging alternatives. Funding mechanisms have created their own forms of intellectual pressure. Government grants for archaeological research often come with implicit expectations about the kinds of results that will support national historical narratives and tourist industries. Proposals suggesting that Viking achievements might be less uniquely Scandinavian, or that maritime sophistication developed earlier than traditionally believed, struggle to receive institutional support. The career trajectories of researchers who pursue challenging interpretations of Viking evidence reveal patterns that extend beyond simple academic evaluation. Graduate students whose dissertations propose fundamental revisions to established chronologies find themselves facing unusually rigorous examination processes. Their job prospects become mysteriously limited, with search committees showing preferences for candidates whose research builds safely on accepted frameworks. Dr. Elsa Rosdahl, despite her towering reputation in Viking studies, found her later career influenced by her willingness to acknowledge evidence that didn't fit conventional patterns. Her observations about technological capabilities that exceeded supposed medieval knowledge, her documentation of international connections that challenged narratives of Scandinavian isolation, made her a respected but somewhat marginalized figure in academic circles. The laboratory politics surrounding scientific analysis of Viking Age materials present their own complications. Dating facilities and materials analysis laboratories often receive samples with limited contextual information, but researchers submitting samples have strong incentives to obtain results that support expected interpretations. When unexpected results emerge, the natural response is to question analytical procedures rather than underlying chronological assumptions. Museum politics add another layer of institutional pressure against revolutionary interpretations. Major Scandinavian museums have invested enormous resources in exhibitions, educational programs, and publications based on established narratives about Viking development. Fundamental revisions to chronologies or technological interpretations would require acknowledgement that decades of public presentation had been fundamentally incomplete or misleading. The international dynamics of Viking studies create additional pressures against disruptive discoveries. Academic exchange programs, collaborative research projects, and conference participation all operate within frameworks of scholarly consensus that make it professionally difficult to propose interpretations that challenge fundamental assumptions shared across institutional boundaries. Recent developments in analytical technology have paradoxically increased pressure for interpretive caution. As techniques become more sophisticated and precise, the potential for discovering evidence that doesn't fit established narratives increases correspondingly. Institutional responses have focused on developing more rigorous standards for accepting challenging results, rather than more flexible frameworks for interpreting unexpected evidence. The digital publication revolution has created new opportunities for disseminating challenging research while also enabling more sophisticated forms of scholarly gatekeeping. Online databases and digital journals can make specialized research more accessible, but editorial control over major publication venues remains concentrated in institutions with strong investments in maintaining established interpretive frameworks. Professional conference dynamics reflect these pressures in ways that shape the broader direction of Viking studies research. Papers presenting conventional interpretations receive prominent scheduling and substantial discussion time, while research proposing fundamental revisions gets relegated to specialized sessions attended by small groups of specialists. The message about acceptable research directions becomes clear without ever being explicitly stated. The impact of these institutional pressures extends beyond individual researchers to entire research programs and methodological approaches. Experimental archaeology materials, analysis, and technological reconstruction, all approaches that might reveal capabilities exceeding traditional assumptions, receive limited support compared to conventional excavation and artifact analysis that builds safely on established knowledge. Dr. William Fitzhugh of the Smithsonian Institution has noted that the capabilities demonstrated by Viking maritime technology represent engineering achievements that modern analysts struggle to explain using conventional assumptions about medieval limitations. Yet rather than embracing these analytical challenges as opportunities for discovering new knowledge about past technological capabilities, institutional archaeology has approached them with caution that sometimes resembles avoidance. As you rest tonight, picture the quiet conversations in laboratory coffee rooms where technicians discuss results that don't match expectations. Imagine the graduate students learning to phrase their discoveries in ways that acknowledge established authority while hinting at deeper complexities. Consider the institutional pressures that shape what kinds of questions about the past are encouraged and what kinds are quietly discouraged. The scientific suppression operating in Viking studies isn't necessarily malicious. It's often the result of institutional inertia, professional caution, and the simple human tendency to resist information that complicates comfortable assumptions. But the effect is the same: a careful management of potentially revolutionary evidence that preserves academic consensus at the expense of historical understanding. Sometimes the most profound truths about the past remain hidden, not because the evidence doesn't exist, but because institutional pressures make it professionally difficult to acknowledge what that evidence actually reveals. As we draw together the threads of evidence that have emerged from our journey through the shadows of Viking archaeology, a remarkable pattern begins to emerge, a pattern that suggests we may have fundamentally misunderstood not just the capabilities of medieval Scandinavian civilization, but the very nature of technological and cultural development during Europe's supposed Dark Ages. The pieces of this hidden puzzle have been lying in plain sight for decades, scattered across museum collections, buried in specialized academic publications, preserved in laboratory reports that never quite made it into mainstream historical narratives. But when we examine this evidence together, free from the institutional pressures that have shaped conventional interpretation, a revolutionary picture begins to emerge. The chronological evidence alone suggests that sophisticated Viking maritime technology existed for centuries before academic consensus places its development. The Salma ship burials, the Herlaugshagen discoveries, the Pre-Viking Age dating results that have been explained away through increasingly complex interpretive gymnastics all point toward technological sophistication that developed much earlier than traditional timelines can accommodate. But the implications extend far beyond simple chronological revision. If Viking ship construction techniques demonstrate mathematical precision that modern analysis can barely explain, if metallurgical capabilities exceeded supposed medieval limitations, if navigational achievements required knowledge systems that traditional histories insist didn't exist, then we must consider the possibility that our entire understanding of medieval European technological development has been fundamentally incomplete. The evidence of international coordination presents perhaps the most challenging aspect of this emerging picture. The standardization of construction techniques across vast distances, the coordination of material supplies and quality control systems, the systematic development of maritime infrastructure all suggest organizational capabilities that traditional narratives attribute to much later periods of European development. The harbour networks discovered through experimental archaeology reveal planned infrastructure development that spanned hundreds of miles of coastline. The burial complexes identified through ground-penetrating radar show coordinated community planning that required administrative systems historians insist didn't exist in medieval Scandinavia. The technological transfer evidence suggests knowledge-sharing networks that operated across cultural and linguistic boundaries, with efficiency that challenges assumptions about medieval isolation and fragmentation. When we examine the symbolic encoding systems embedded in Viking ship decorations, we find information storage methods that suggest solutions to knowledge preservation and transmission problems that challenge medieval societies generally. The astronomical alignments, mathematical relationships, and navigational data preserved in decorative elements represent technological achievements that required systematic understanding of principles supposedly not formalized in Europe for several more centuries. The pattern of evidence suppression and institutional resistance to revolutionary interpretations reveals how academic consensus can become self-perpetuating, maintaining comfortable narratives through interpretive caution that sometimes resembles willful blindness to challenging evidence. The careful management of potentially disruptive discoveries, the asymmetrical standards applied to conventional versus challenging research, the career pressures that discourage pursuit of revolutionary interpretations all contribute to preservation of academic orthodoxy at the expense of historical understanding. But perhaps most significantly, the emerging evidence suggests that Viking maritime achievements weren't the isolated products of Scandinavian innovation operating in cultural vacuum. Instead, they appear to represent components of broader technological and organizational systems that spanned Northern Europe and possibly extended far beyond traditional assumptions about medieval cultural boundaries. The implications for our understanding of medieval European civilization are profound. If the organizational capabilities, technological sophistication, and international coordination suggested by Viking evidence represent typical rather than exceptional achievements, then academic characterizations of the medieval period as primitive, fragmented, and technologically limited require fundamental revision. The possibility emerges that what historians have characterized as the Dark Ages may actually represent a period of technological and organizational achievement whose true scope has been obscured by institutional preferences for narratives that emphasize later European developments as revolutionary advances over supposedly primitive medieval foundations. Consider the implications if Viking Age Scandinavia possessed administrative systems capable of coordinating infrastructure development across vast distances, knowledge preservation methods that maintain technological sophistication across generations, and international communication networks that facilitated systematic cultural and technological exchange. Such capabilities would suggest medieval European civilization operated at levels of sophistication that academic consensus has consistently underestimated. The DNA evidence from ship burials, despite its technical complications and analytical uncertainties, hints at population connections that span vast geographic distances. The genetic markers suggesting Iranian ancestry in Norwegian burials, the evidence of international connections in seemingly isolated communities, the patterns of cultural exchange that extended far beyond traditional assumptions about medieval travel and communication, all point toward a medieval world far more connected and cosmopolitan than conventional histories acknowledge. The technological achievements preserved in Viking ship construction represent just one manifestation of capabilities that may have characterized medieval European civilization more broadly. The mathematical precision, materials science knowledge, and engineering sophistication demonstrated in Viking maritime technology suggest educational systems and knowledge preservation methods whose existence traditional histories have never adequately acknowledged or explained. As you rest tonight, imagine the true scope of medieval Scandinavian civilization, the planned communities revealed by radar archaeology, the international networks suggested by materials analysis, the sophisticated knowledge systems preserved in symbolic encoding methods, the organizational achievements demonstrated by coordinated infrastructure development. Picture a medieval world where technological sophistication and cultural coordination operated at levels that academic consensus has spent over a century minimizing or explaining away. The hidden network of capabilities, connections, and achievements that emerges from careful analysis of Viking evidence suggests that we may need to fundamentally reconsider not just our understanding of Scandinavian medieval culture, but our assumptions about the trajectory of European technological development generally. The Dark Ages may not have been as dark as institutional archaeology has led us to believe. As our journey through the hidden mysteries of Viking longships draws toward its close, we find ourselves confronting the humbling reality that the most profound questions about these remarkable vessels and the civilization that created them remain tantalizingly unanswered. Each piece of evidence we've examined, each institutional contradiction we've explored, each technological mystery we've encountered opens new avenues of inquiry that challenge our most basic assumptions about the past. The fundamental question of how Viking shipbuilders achieved such extraordinary precision using supposedly primitive tools continues to elude satisfactory explanation. Modern attempts to replicate their construction methods have consistently failed to match the mathematical accuracy, structural sophistication, and durability of original examples. The gap between documented achievements and reconstructed capabilities has grown so large that it suggests either our understanding of their technology is fundamentally incomplete, or their actual capabilities exceeded what conventional archaeological interpretation is willing to acknowledge. The chronological mysteries present equally challenging puzzles. If the Salma ships represent typical rather than exceptional examples of pre-Viking Age maritime sophistication, how many other early discoveries have been misinterpreted or overlooked? If radiocarbon dating consistently produces results that contradict established timelines, are the analytical techniques flawed, or are the timelines themselves built on inadequate foundations? The evidence of international coordination raises questions that extend far beyond Viking studies into fundamental issues about medieval European civilization. How did technological knowledge spread so rapidly and accurately across vast distances in societies that supposedly lacked systematic communication networks? What organizational structures coordinated the development of maritime infrastructure that spanned hundreds of miles of coastline? How did quality control systems maintain standardization across different cultures and linguistic groups? The symbolic encoding systems embedded in ship decorations suggest information storage and transmission methods whose full capabilities remain largely unexplored. If astronomical data, navigational information, and technical knowledge were routinely preserved in decorative elements, what other complex information might be encoded in medieval artifacts that conventional archaeology has interpreted as purely artistic? How sophisticated were the knowledge preservation systems that medieval societies actually possessed? The institutional dynamics that have shaped Viking studies research raise equally important questions about how archaeological knowledge is created and maintained. Why have potentially revolutionary discoveries been subjected to interpretive caution that sometimes resembles systematic avoidance? What mechanisms cause academic institutions to prefer comfortable narratives over challenging evidence? How does professional consensus become self-perpetuating in ways that resist disruptive information? The future of Viking studies may depend increasingly on technological advances that enable new forms of analysis, while bypassing some of the institutional pressures that have limited conventional research. Ground-penetrating radar continues to reveal buried landscapes that challenge traditional assumptions about settlement patterns and social organization. Advanced materials analysis produces ever more precise data about construction techniques and technological capabilities. Digital modeling allows reconstruction of engineering solutions that were previously impossible to analyze. But technological capabilities alone cannot address the interpretive frameworks that shape how evidence is understood and presented. The most sophisticated analytical techniques will continue to produce results that challenge conventional narratives, and institutional responses to such challenges will continue to influence which discoveries receive serious attention and which are explained away through increasingly complex theoretical elaborations. The international scope of Viking influence continues to reveal new dimensions that complicate simple narratives about Scandinavian expansion and cultural diffusion. Recent discoveries in Estonia, Poland, and other regions suggest maritime sophistication and cultural connections that operated at scales historians have never adequately acknowledged. How extensive were the networks of technological and cultural exchange that connected medieval European societies? What organizational capabilities made such extensive coordination possible? The DNA evidence from ship burials, despite its technical limitations and analytical uncertainties, hints at population movements and cultural connections that span vast geographic distances. As genetic analysis techniques continue to improve, what new evidence might emerge about the origins, connections, and movements of the people who created Viking maritime civilization? How might such evidence challenge or confirm traditional assumptions about medieval population dynamics and cultural development? The preservation challenges facing Viking archaeological sites continue to intensify as development pressure and environmental change threaten locations that may contain crucial evidence about past technological capabilities and social organization. How many potential discoveries will be lost before they can be investigated? What evidence has already been destroyed through agricultural activity, urban development, or natural erosion? The educational implications of emerging Viking research extend beyond specialized academic circles into fundamental questions about how societies understand and present their own histories. What happens when new evidence contradicts historical narratives that have become central to national identities, tourist industries, and educational systems? How do institutions balance the excitement of discovery against the practical challenges of revising established interpretative frameworks? As you drift towards sleep tonight, let these questions settle gently in your mind like snow falling on still water. Consider the possibility that the most important discoveries about Viking maritime civilization may still await revelation hidden beneath farmlands that have never been systematically surveyed, preserved in museum collections, that have never been fully analysed encoded in decorative systems whose symbolic languages we have yet to decipher. The mysteries of Viking longships represent more than historical puzzles. They are windows into fundamental questions about how human societies develop, preserve, and transmit technological knowledge across generations and geographic distances. The answers to these questions may reshape not just our understanding of medieval Scandinavian culture, but our assumptions about the trajectory of human technological development generally. Sometimes the most profound questions are those we don't yet know how to ask, and the most important discoveries are those that challenge our most basic assumptions about what past societies could achieve. As we reach the end of our gentle journey through the shadowed mysteries of Viking maritime archaeology, I want to leave you with something more valuable than conclusions. I want to offer you the tools and perspective to continue this investigation yourself, to become an active participant in uncovering the hidden truths that institutional archaeology has been reluctant to fully explore. Your mission, should you choose to accept it, begins with developing what I call archaeological skepticism, not cynical dismissal of expert knowledge, but thoughtful questioning of institutional narratives that may have become more comfortable than accurate. When you visit museums, don't simply absorb the information presented in polished displays. Look for what isn't being explained, question the gaps in the narrative, notice when confident presentations gloss over analytical uncertainties. The next time you encounter Viking ship exhibits, examine the descriptions carefully. Notice when museum texts use phrases like "probably seems to indicate" or "is thought to represent." These linguistic hedges often mark areas where the evidence is less certain than confident presentation suggests. Ask yourself why certain aspects of construction receive detailed explanation, while others are described in vague generalities. Pay attention to dating information and notice when it seems overly precise or when ranges are presented without acknowledgement of analytical uncertainty. Carbon dating, dendrochronology, and other scientific techniques have limitations that museum presentations rarely discuss. When you see phrases like "built around 850 AD, remember that such precision often represents interpretive choice rather than analytical certainty. Look for evidence of international connections that museum narratives might minimize. Notice when artifact descriptions mention materials from distant regions, construction techniques that appear across different cultures, or artistic elements that suggest contact networks extending far beyond traditional assumptions about medieval isolation. Ask yourself why such connections might be downplayed in presentations focused on local or national achievements. Develop the habit of examining archaeological evidence with fresh eyes, unencumbered by assumptions about what medieval societies could or couldn't achieve. When you see the mathematical precision of Viking ship construction, the sophistication of their metallurgy, the coordination evident in their infrastructure development, ask yourself whether these achievements really represent the capabilities of primitive societies, or whether our assumptions about medieval limitations need fundamental revision. Seek out primary sources and specialized academic publications that present evidence in more detail than popular presentations typically provide. Learn to navigate archaeological journals, technical reports, and conference proceedings where researchers discuss analytical uncertainties and interpretive challenges that simplified narratives often omit. Notice the difference between what specialists acknowledge privately and what institutions present publicly. Practice reading academic publications with attention to what they don't say as much as what they do. Notice when papers present evidence that challenges established narratives but phrase their conclusions cautiously. Look for patterns where revolutionary implications are acknowledged indirectly while conventional interpretations are maintained explicitly. When you encounter claims about technological limitations in medieval societies, ask for evidence rather than accepting assertions based on traditional assumptions. If Viking shipbuilders couldn't have possessed mathematical knowledge, what specific evidence supports this limitation? If international coordination was impossible in medieval Scandinavia, what analytical techniques have been used to establish this impossibility. Develop awareness of how institutional pressures influence archaeological interpretation. Universities, museums, and research institutions operate within professional, financial, and political contexts that can influence how evidence is presented and interpreted. National identity, tourist industry interests, and academic career considerations all create pressures that may affect how revolutionary discoveries are received and presented. Support archaeological research that challenges conventional narratives by staying informed about new discoveries and analytical techniques. Follow the work of researchers who pursue experimental archaeology, advanced materials analysis, and interdisciplinary approaches that might reveal capabilities traditional archaeology has overlooked. Notice which researchers face institutional resistance and ask yourself why challenging orthodox interpretations might be professionally difficult. Engage with the evidence personally by visiting archaeological sites, handling replica artifacts when possible, and developing direct familiarity with the technological challenges that medieval craftsmen solved. The more you understand about the practical difficulties of ancient construction techniques, the more remarkable their achievements become, and the more questionable become assertions about their supposed limitations. Consider the broader implications of archaeological mysteries for your understanding of human technological development. If medieval societies possess capabilities that conventional histories don't acknowledge, what does this suggest about the trajectory of human innovation? How might systematic underestimation of past achievements affect our assumptions about future possibilities? Remember that the most important archaeological discoveries often challenge comfortable assumptions rather than confirming them. Revolutionary evidence requires courage to acknowledge and intellectual flexibility to accept. The history that emerges from careful examination of challenging evidence may be more complex and more remarkable than the simplified narratives that institutions sometimes prefer to maintain. As you continue this investigation in your own life, approach each new piece of evidence with the patience of a careful detective and the wonder of an explorer. The mysteries of Viking maritime civilization represent just one example of how archaeological evidence can reveal past achievements that exceed conventional expectations. Similar mysteries await discovery in other historical periods and other technological traditions. Your mission is to remain curious, skeptical, and open to possibilities that challenge established narratives. The past may be far more remarkable than institutional archaeology has been willing to acknowledge, and the future of historical understanding may depend on individuals like you who refuse to accept simplified explanations when complex evidence suggests more extraordinary truths. Tonight, we've journeyed together through the shadowed archives of maritime archaeology, uncovering evidence that suggests the story of Viking longships is far more complex and far more mysterious than official histories would have us believe. We've seen how radiocarbon dating reveals ship construction techniques that predate the supposed Viking Age by centuries, how ground-penetrating radar is revealing networks of buried ships that suggest a civilization far more organized and widespread than previously imagined, and how modern analysis continues to uncover technological capabilities that challenge fundamental assumptions about medieval limitations. We've explored the academic silence surrounding finds that contradict established timelines, the institutional pressures that shape which discoveries receive serious attention, and which are explained away through increasingly complex interpretations. We've examined the evidence of international coordination in shipbuilding techniques, the sophisticated knowledge systems embedded in decorative elements, and the systematic infrastructure development that required organizational capabilities historians have consistently underestimated. Perhaps most intriguingly, we've glimpsed the pattern of evidence management, how discoveries that challenge comfortable narratives find themselves relegated to specialized publications and private conferences away from public scrutiny. We've seen how professional consensus can become self-perpetuating, maintaining established interpretations through institutional momentum rather than careful evaluation of challenging evidence. Yet profound mysteries remain. Who were the master shipwrights whose techniques we still can't fully understand or successfully replicate? How did construction knowledge spread across vast distances with accuracy that suggests systematic educational programs rather than casual cultural borrowing? Why do certain museums and institutions seem reluctant to publish findings that contradict established chronologies? And what other evidence might be waiting in storage rooms and private collections filed away under categories that don't adequately reflect their revolutionary implications? Your mission as you drift off to sleep tonight is to approach all historical narratives with gentle skepticism and informed curiosity. Question the official stories not from cynicism, but from wonder about what more remarkable truths might lie beneath comfortable assumptions. Ask to see the evidence that doesn't fit the analytical results that required further investigation, the discoveries that somehow never quite made it into final publications. Remember that the most profound truths about the past often challenge our most basic assumptions about what earlier societies could achieve. The history that emerges from careful examination of all the evidence, not just the pieces that fit established narratives, may reveal human capabilities and achievements far more remarkable than institutional archaeology has been willing to acknowledge. If these hidden corners of Viking maritime history have captured your imagination, consider subscribing for more investigations into the archaeological mysteries that powerful institutions would prefer remained buried. Next week, we'll explore another carefully managed secret, the suppressed evidence of pre-Columbian contact between the Old and New Worlds that's slowly emerging from Arctic ice, challenging everything we thought we knew about the age of exploration and the true scope of medieval international connections. Until then, sleep, while dream of distant shores and impossible voyages, and remember the most amazing discoveries are often those that force us to question everything we thought we knew about the capabilities of our ancestors. The past may be far stranger, far more sophisticated and far more remarkable than the simplified stories we've been told. And somewhere in museum storage rooms and laboratory files, the evidence waits for curious minds, brave enough to ask the questions that academic institutions have been hesitant to pursue. The secrets beneath the waves are still calling to those who know how to listen. Sweet dreams, and may your curiosity never be satisfied by easy answers, when extraordinary evidence suggests more profound truths await discovery.